And smack that record button. Alrighty, cool. So this will be I guess this will technically be like our fifth upload to the Natural Order. I'm here with Jared, and we met through Twitter, I believe, through some mutual circles of there, had some good conversations. Feel like we're kind of moving in the same direction, and found a good opportunity to jump on to have a discussion. And the topic we chose for today kind of centers around Christianity and a little bit of a banger that Jared did bring up, which is specifically kind of around the decline of Christianity, and also an idea that Thomas Aquinas presented, which is the Aeon of Antichrist. So I'll leave it there. I'll toss the ball to you to provide some context as to kind of what that entails and where you want to go from here.
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard because a lot of it's read into. Most of the Ion comes from Carl Jung.
Right.
So for those like Jungians, he had the last book here before he died was Ion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where he was kind of diving into a couple of different things, to be honest. It's a really dense book. Like when you read Nietzsche, you read a couple of sentences and it takes like 3.5 paragraphs to break it down. Ion's the same way.
Right.
It
Yeah.
was Well, yeah, I think Jordan Peterson was like it was like the scariest book he ever read kind of thing.
Wow. Okay.
Um, and I mean he's a Jungian, so but yeah, he was kind of like delving into kind of like astrology, and he wasn't like directly pointing at like oh the stars dictate. He was just kind of like looking, and he was like, isn't it kind of weird how um, the stars tend to accurately kind of reflect the current state of like in stages or like ions as he called them.
Yeah.
But the only way that you could say that reasonably would call be like from a psychological perspective. Um,
Yeah.
and Jung pulled heavily from like Aquinas because Aquinas had a lot of different. I mean, his book is like anyone who says they've read his book all the way through is lying. No one can read Thomas Aquinas all the way through. His books are so long.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, he kind of pulled a lot from his work, delving into like the Christianity aspects of it. But
Right.
if you said you want me to elaborate on like
Well,
there's
so
like about 6 videos worth of lead up that's probably going to
right.
be required for me to
So
explain this completely.
yeah. So a couple notes, a little bit of context that'll help here. So I know in our first conversation we kind of identified that both of us were kind of versed or familiar with and identify with people like Jung and Nietzsche in particular. Um, and then also like you alluded to through Jung's work, and there is this kind of just general understanding of things like astrology or just some of these more occult principles where it's not perfectly like scientifically described, but yet there's some patterns and there's something going on
There's a
there.
lot of things. There's a lot of things you can't prove with the scientific method.
Exactly, but that doesn't
That's
mean
that's
there's
that
not.
realm.
It doesn't mean there's not
Yeah,
relevant and
that's
there's
true.
not patterns,
Yep.
right? And so that's where we're starting to dive into here. And I also wanted to add, just talking about the Aeon and some of the, where I first heard that word, and to talk more about the occult is Aleister Crowley. I know he did some work in that space. And then lastly, I was going to say too. Um, I remember because you said Young was like studying Aquinas and some of the Christians. I remember a quote from Young where he says that it wasn't until he came across the Gnostics that it was like the first like people he had read about that he felt like was really hitting on
Yeah,
some of the same things as him.
The Gnostics were the first psychologists, and
Exactly.
that's probably why they were all killed. Because it's
It's
terrifying.
like
Well,
witchcraft. It's
when
like
you encounter,
witchcraft or sorcery.
well, it
Yeah.
is. Because if you're a Christian, I mean, hell, I mean, even like up until the 1600s, like Galileo was murdered, not murdered, tried or whatever, because
Right.
he suggested that the Earth was not the center of the world.
Yes.
I mean, because for Christianity to be true, you have to ignore a lot of different aspects of natural law and natural order for that matter.
Yes.
And then anything that's deflectable is called a Mott and Bailey argument, where, you have the medieval Motts and then the Bailey.
Hmm.
So you have your initial counter, which is I believe this because this is why. Almost always they cite the Bible.
Right.
They're citing the Bible as evidence for the Bible, which just doesn't make any
It's
sense, but
circular
that's they
logic.
do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, that's the Mont Bailey, and then when you attack it, and almost always you can, they retreat and they go, it's a faith-based religion.
Yeah.
That's the Mont and Bailey. So I never debate with Christians. It's not because I have a lot of respect for Christianity. I have a lot of admiration for the culture. I was raised by that culture.
Yeah.
Um, it's just I don't debate with them because there's no points. You're not convincing them of anything. So
Right.
there's like why bother? Just respect them, respect the belief, and move on.
So,
But continue.
well, what I was going to say is, so that's kind of where the context and the value and kind of the plan that I had as far as my contribution to this discussion is just a larger kind of discussion about Christianity, and we will get there. One thing I was going to say, because you mentioned how dense like this particular topic is about like the Aeon and Antichrist and Thomas Aquinas and whatnot.
Psychological ions, yeah.
Yeah, so one thing I'll say, like, as you know, is that there's, and we'll provide some links that Uber Boyo, I believe, did some great coverage. I think that's some of the videos that you're talking about, and he's
Yeah,
obviously
I would
operating.
be careful. I would be careful with Boyle because he's an excellent storyteller, but
Right.
some of his details does not get right. Which is fine. It
Sure.
doesn't matter at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's correct enough, but like if you're gonna go, don't watch I don't know how many episodes, 20 episodes, and then
Right.
go debate someone educated in the topic because you're gonna lose.
Right.
Just take it as like with a grain of salt.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great context because I haven't watched it yet. I was just like, wow, I saw like the one part of the one video, and I saw it was a larger series. So I will probably link
Yeah,
that for people.
James does a good job keeping him. Now, obviously, this is a couple years ago. They're just young 20s. They're fucking around in these videos sometimes.
Right.
So like the introduction's a little bit kind of goofy. This messing around, just hanging out with each other, and then they kind of get into the topics. But no, James Dowling is really well educated, and Jung specifically,
Hell yeah.
a lot better than either me or you. I think his follower count's probably low enough to where you can get a video with him if you so chose to.
Yeah. That's a great.
I've
That's a
never
great
had a
reference. Yeah.
direct conversation with him, but yeah, I think what's his channel called now? I've been following these guys since like 2018, 2017 when they were still baby channels.
Hell
So
yeah.
I think it's Jung to Live By is probably what I think it's what it's called.
Right.
You can I would probably try him first.
Cool.
Uber Boyo is getting a little bit narcissistic recently.
Right.
Respect to him, but he's getting a little high up there where he doesn't want to talk with people.
Right. So yeah, yeah. So I'll just lead a reference to that. Some great context for anybody who wants to check that out. And so coming back to this, I guess I'll leave it to you. Would you like to try to dive into that topic of the Aeon and the Antichrist, or just maybe zoom out and just kind of like cover just like Christianity in
I
general?
don't feel it's appropriate to delve into a topic like that without if that's I understand that's what we want to talk about, and if we're going to talk about esoteric themes and schema, then yeah, we might want to talk about that. But in essence, the ion of the Antichrist, just to summarize it,
Yeah.
it goes in psychological ions roughly around 2,000 years. For a couple of different reasons, there was some astrological goings on, such as like the god of Rome and the Christian god. The astrological signs were kind of like against each other.
Right.
Um, Around the time Christ was born, and then around 400 AD, there was a series of things occurring. You had, what the hell was his name? Arara, a Florentine or something.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of like the kind of like the middle point between this current ion, which is Pisces.
Right.
So Christ is the fish, but
Interesting.
when Pisces is a two-headed fish, and so the psychology of, or let's say an explanation of the psychology would suggest you have 1,000 years and then 1,000 years rather than a straight two for the psychological. And so the first 1,000 years would be the ion of Christ or the pursuit of the highest good. And then the next 1,000 years, which is what we're currently in, is the ion of the Antichrist, which is a constant, ever increasing pursuit of evil. And there is a plethora of different aspects that you can dive into that I'm not going to cite off the top of my head because I would be bullshitting you and I don't want to lie. So
Right.
I would need to start. If you want to have this conversation, let me know, and I'll read. Give me like 2 weeks, and I can have stuff in my head.
Sure.
Enough to talk reasonably about it. It's just I read so much to where things get shoved back in there, and I don't have an accurate way to
Yeah, you got to go.
tell you without lying. Well, no, the worst part is like when you know enough about a topic to talk bullshit about it, but you're
Right.
just stretching the truth to the point where it's like they don't know you're lying, but you know you're lying, and it bothers the fuck out of me.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I'm gonna do that.
Cool. Yeah, I was gonna say, I have obviously a good bit of to say and a good bit of background just in Christianity in general, and I also have a good bit of context about just like
Yep.
esotericism in general. I'm not too familiar with like the idea of like these psychological aeons and what that entails. So we can kind of play
The
it.
occult tend to follow that more so than anyone else. The Gnostics abide by the psychological ions. So,
Yeah,
they're when you're talking about them, you need to understand the way they perceive the world, and they perceive the world in astro. What was the saying? I had a one of my mentors tell me this. He was like, millionaires don't care about astrology, but billionaires do.
hell yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was like, that is
I
interesting.
like that because it's kind of like this idea of how occultism has existed in our society, which is that you've got these mesoteric, these kind of middle layers of people who are able to achieve that they're highly competent, they're able to achieve a good bit, but ultimately they're not concerned with the big picture. It's only those people at the top who are concerned with that, and that's how they get there. Yeah, so I like that, but I guess going back to this particular Aeon we're talking about, so is it the Aeon of Pisces that started 1,000 years ago? Is that correct or no?
Yeah, 400 AD around that time. And then there was an inflection point, which is around the 1300s, which is where you get Dante, Aquinas. There was a couple of different intellectuals that were extremely pivotal, that created the momentum that we have today. So, like modern Christianity, as an example, of like an inflection point, is not actually Christian. It is McCarthyist.
Interesting.
Like if you talk to a Southern Baptist, they're not being Christian. They're McCarthyism. It's if you Google McCarthyism in the 1950s, it's
Like
literally just the Bible Belt.
like
Like
the
they're
like the
not
communist
following biblical.
like
Yeah, I
the
mean they're
communist witch hunt.
kind of, but it's like that's like if you look at McCarthyism and you look at the modern like Baptist church as an
Yeah.
example, they look more McCarthy than Christian, and so that could be considered like a antichrist, right? During the age or it's called like the age of the antichrist. So like there's a series of pivots, and I detest numerology, but when you're going into ions, you kind of have to look at symbolisms,
Right.
and you can make as many symbolisms as you want. I can spend here all day and just, have a whole intellectual masturbation session on all this different crap. But like, it doesn't
Right.
matter at the end of the day.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
it's yeah, but it is interesting to think about the fact that human psychology is so consistent that you can literally map out in the stars how it's going to play out, um, based on written or recorded writings on the original medical system, which is using the stars to determine issues.
Hell yeah. Um, I wanted to go back to you said you said the Gnostics were the first psychologists, and that's very much how I've described and kind of use occultism at large. Is that like we've only had psychology as a field, as a kind of a part of a scientific field for a couple hundred years. So how did people talk about all these concepts for ever since before then? It was pretty much through some of these more like occult systems and languages.
It
Um,
was occultism, and then it was viewed through the lens of Christianity.
yeah, exactly. Which has there's obviously a lot of occult ties into that and through that. Um, and back to the idea that you talked about how psychology is very mechanical. It is very and this is something that comes out of the institute is that it is a very scientific, almost like mechanical field that we can study and understand. And so too are the stars. The star, everything in our reality is ultimately has like a high degree of patterned and kind of like a consistency to it. And so it's like why then would there not be some kind of potential connection between the two? Whether that's the cycles of the
Or
moons or the cycles of the
at a
planets.
minimum, you could map it out
Right.
like a physical map, if that makes sense. So it's like we can have cause. Remember, just all consciousness is pattern recognition
Right.
on like it's like a spiraled up. And then so theoretically speaking, it should be consistent. Meaning, if it's consistent, it has a pattern, and if it has a pattern, you can map out cause and effect theoretically, definitely, until we evolve or something else happens.
And I guess there is a counterpoint to keep in mind, which is that there could be like a pattern system over here like our psychology, and then there could be a pattern system over here, like the moving of the planets, and they could be separate. They could just have their own patterns, but not necessarily have an interrelation. So, there might be some debate there, but it seems like
Yeah, and there is also the theory that because when planetary masses do have frequencies
right,
based off of their gravitational fields and their atmospheres coming in contact, it's just the way physics works.
right,
A large quantity has a mass, and depending on the size and location and relative to the sun, it has a different wave, like sound wave.
right.
And so, the theory can go that, when you encounter those frequencies or like when a certain ones match up, theoretically like the gravitational fields that go all the way back can carry over that, and that can have an impact on the human brain. Like you can't use there's no way to use a scientific method to prove that. So it's like it's
Or disprove.
speculation, but at the end of the day, you can't ignore that. That's not like you can, but I don't suggest it because
Yeah,
it's
yeah. I mean,
there's a lot more truth
that's a
in
good
some of
point.
this than
Like
people want to admit.
if someone was to come along and say, "Oh, these are just two totally separate processes," like you've just established a connection between the two. Like humans are definitely affected by and I believe emit electromagnetic system like signals, and are, yeah, affected by it, and so do planets. So there,
No,
yeah, there you go.
I mean, you could take it to the extreme. You can go to the electric universe nuts that are just, expecting the world to end based on cycle theory. But,
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't think we should go that far.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing I wanted to come back to. So you said McCarthyism. I wanted to. I'm not even very familiar. Like when I hear McCarthyism, I'm thinking of like the 1950s like witch hunts of communists. Is this a separate thing?
So, Kurt likes McCarthy. He's just a conservative, but well, remember, after the Civil War, Christianity was dying. The Gilded Age made it worse. Most people were mostly unequal. And then right after that, you had, a decadent spiral. You had World War One, Spanish flu, World War Two. Christianity was just done. It was tired. It was done.
Interesting.
McCarthy, well, first off, the IQ dropped precipitously during that time period.
Hmm.
And so but politics were able to hijack on that. I have a feeling that's why the boomers are so submissive, is because their parents were not smart enough to detect bullshit.
Hmm.
Or maybe not, intellectual bullshit. Like they can determine bullshit like a salesman, but like when you're talking about higher level philosophical or even like political aspects, they're not gonna know.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's a huge issue. But no, McCarthy started like a whole ass Christian revival. If you really look at what it was, like the Bible Belt came from him.
Interesting. So tell me
Yeah,
what.
I think he was a speaker of the House. I think.
Okay. And so this is the same guy who these communist witch hunts were named after, but obviously he was involved in other things. So how do you think he? And of course, there may be more research and reading to be done outside of this, but
Well,
just
let me give you an example. Donald Trump created 30 million Trumpers,
right,
right? So that's a movement,
right.
and that's a theology and not theology. That's a way of
It
living in
sort
the
of is. I
making.
mean, it kind of it almost is like
And
a
so, but when you go backwards, they didn't have Twitter. That's where Trump got a lot of his momentum. They didn't have social media.
yeah
You
churches
had the radio.
and
You
radio.
had the
Yeah,
radio and churches. And so when you have one guy saying a whole bunch of things, pointing things out. What do you call it? You call it an honest liar, right? So an honest liar comes and he points out all the problems, and he knows exactly what you're thinking. But then he says, okay, now we're going to do it my way. And then he lies to you. So he's honest, and then he lies.
right,
And that I think I mean, Trump's an honest liar too. I mean, it's
right.
super. If you're specifically with conservatism, because they're so hyperbolous,
Hmm.
um, an honest liar can hijack almost any conservative movement. When the average IQ is below probably 95 to 100, and it's sitting around 95 ish right now among the
Interesting.
tradesmen. So, yeah.
So what you said it, he was an honest liar. So what do you think he was honest about, and what do you think he was lying about?
I mean, I'm not, you know, super educated in like what he was thinking at the time, but it's just like the way he was speaking. I mean, he was creating a witch hunt against the communists,
Right.
but his logic was this. And by the way, he was correct.
Hmm.
And if you don't think he's correct, look out today. I mean, not obviously outside of our windows is
Oh, he
probably
was right about
safe
the
and
communists, I
calm.
think. Yeah, I agree with that
But
one.
no, he was right. And the communists did come, but they didn't come where he said they were going to come.
Right.
He was like, they're going to come in and they're going to take over everything, and you're going to lose sovereignty, and they're going to enslave your children and all this crap. And it's like, yeah, they did, but they used the school system and academia, um,
Right.
not through the churches and everything else and the
If
governments.
anything, it was Yuri.
So,
It was that Yuri Bezmenov in the '80s, I believe, somewhere around there. He recorded
mhm.
that video, the Russian KGB defector who talked
Yep.
about like the steps of demoralization and how they would actually do it. And that was definitely more spot on. But of course, that was 30 years later after he had already taken hold. I'm sure. Um,
Yeah, I mean, the academia had actually been captured before the 30s.
right.
I mean,
Damn.
Marcuse was, um, he was like what 40s.
Hmm.
Uh, he was a huge influence on Crenshaw, which is what created the modern CRT movement that you're seeing a lot
Yeah.
of. Like in my DA in Philly,
Yeah.
he subscribes to C. I mean, he's just a white idiot. Yeah, I call them useful idiots because he is.
Right.
Um,
Good goy.
he's pushing that stuff, not understanding he's committing political suicide.
Mm. Damn. Yeah, there's just so many ignorant people. So yeah, that's cool. I'll do more research into like McCarthy and the time and like kind of the rise of like Southern Baptism and Protestantism, and so that's the whole thread. I will. So I want to rewind a little bit. So we said the Aeon of Pisces started around 400, but there have been kind of like pivot or slash inflection points along the way, and you mentioned like 1300 around Aquinas around that time. So is that 1300? Is that when the age of the Antichrist is that when the age of Antichrist, roughly psychological or whatever, began?
It's not that it like begins in movements because
It's like a slow
the way
transition.
I
Yeah.
yeah, I mean like the problem is when you're talking about because remember we're extrapolating intent here.
Right.
So when I read through Aquinas and he has his descriptors. I mean, you can Google Thomas Aquinas writings on the end of the world, and
Right.
he will kind of like point to different things. And ultimately, he had a more restrictionist, like he left it up to God kind of thing.
Right.
Whereas Jung took it farther, and he was like, okay, let's take a look at this. What the hell is going on here? Um, and yeah, it kind of broke it up into psychological ages, and then you can actually look at dates and you can see these things occurring. So Christianity from like 400 to 1300 was largely uninhibited. The Crusades occurred during that time for reasons most people get wrong. Um, you had a lot of, the rise of the church. There was, Islam wasn't doing too hot during that time. They were conquering, but they were still losing.
Right.
And then around 1300, the church started to attack itself. You had a bunch of different prophets come up. I'm trying to remember this one. The one guy that it wasn't Jung who referenced it in one of their Uber Boyos podcasts with James. He discusses this individual. Um, you ever play Assassin's Creed 2?
I've played some of them.
Okay, the DLC, the bad guy in that one, that's who I'm talking about.
Interesting.
Unrelated. I was just hoping that would trigger a face in your head or a name. No, but he was in Florence and he was essentially creating his own little cult. And that was kind of like a big movement. And then of course you had Martin Luther right after. And Christianity started to segment and break apart, and it's still breaking apart. And now Christianity is at a point where it's hollow.
Hmm. Yeah.
But
So
yeah, there's but I don't really know the whole esoteric values behind the two-headed fish, but I know if you talk to astrology people, which I don't because they're annoying, um, they kind of like will break down like the map of the stars and like the different meanings of the planets, and then you can mirror that onto historical events, which is what Hume did. And he came to the conclusion of like the ions.
So, I think what I'm wanting to do at this point is like maybe we'll set aside the astrological parallels for a second and just kind of talk about just the history of Christianity and some of those branches that came out at that time or just in general, just set the context. So it's something I still have room to learn from, because mostly what I'm concerned with is how it looks today, and I'm like, here's the state it's in today, and here's how we should react to that. But it is valuable, I think, to go back and look at where it came from, because and recently I've had some people that have advocated for like the Roman Catholic, or the Catholicism, and some benefits to that. People like even E. Michael Jones, and
It's a hierarchy. It's useful,
yeah.
especially in a valueless world.
You mean like Catholicism has like a more of a hierarchy built in?
Well, that's it. It's just structure. It's no different than the military.
Right.
You know, the
Oh yes, yes.
military. I mean, they'll have you sweeping grass. Why? No one fucking knows. It's just that's what sergeants told me to do, right? So like when you go to the Catholic Church and they say a whole bunch of crap, they're like, "Oh, you have to do this," and you say, "Aye, aye, Captain." Like it's we are humans. We like hierarchy. I mean, we do
Yeah.
dumb stuff.
And,
I'm not trying to shit on Catholicism, but I'm like ultimately that's what it is. It's just a structure and it's
yeah.
a value system already there for you that fits in today's world. And just like the Jews, where they say, the Torah means whatever the rabbi tells it to mean, essentially,
Right.
because it's able to move with the times. Christianity, it does not have that luxury. Catholicism does because of the Pope. The Pope
Yes.
knows this too. I mean, I would imagine the Pope has to know, what he's pushing might not be so as much as true as he would like to say it is. Um,
Right.
and so when he's able to look at the world from a disconnected skyscraper, I might add, which is a violation of like six different laws of power. So I wish him luck because yeah, good luck. Don't I mean, yeah, isolating yourself is never a good idea. Um, but yeah, he's able to like declare things like gay marriage is okay and this and that, and he doesn't have to amend it, just like the Jews don't amend the Torah,
Yeah.
right? So,
Interesting. So
um,
yeah.
but it's able to move with the times and the changing. But Christianity is stuck. It's actually stuck in the 50s, and I don't like as technology becomes more advanced, religion becomes less useful
Hmm.
because it answers less and less questions. So it's like when you
Right.
talk to a Christian and they're like, "How do you respond to transgenderism?" Which is essentially a Nietzschean idea of you can impose your will to power on reality. And you can tell reality, I don't give a fuck what you tell me I am. I am what I say I am. Now, your brain's going to destroy itself. You're going to go crazy. You're probably neurotic and you're
But you
going to
can do
commit
it. You have
suicide
the
before
option.
30, but you
Yeah.
can do it. Um,
Yeah.
and so, Christianity is having a hard time. And I don't know what they're going to do when we start cloning humans.
Oh God.
Like how does the Bible answer those questions? And
There's
so what?
yeah.
Well, no. What ends up happening is, and I've seen this happen in my own life with the church, is they'll refer to verses that they're having to have absorb more and more responsibility to their intended purpose.
Right.
So when they're like, oh well, if you reference verse 16 or James chapter 5, and it's like they'll reference it, and it's like that's not what that verse was intended to answer. You're forcing it to be answered that way. Like one of my favorites is it's like, do not commit adultery. And I'm like, okay, define marriage. Nowhere in the Bible does it define marriage, but it's considered a sin if I have sex before marriage. Define marriage. Does God define it? No. How do I know I'm not sinning? What if I'm doing it wrong?
Right. Yeah.
Like it's like those questions are not answered.
Right.
But when culture collapses, the culture that Christianity was invented in, um, is collapsing. And so when you ask questions like that, that's not answered because it wasn't intended to answer that question. This is exactly what happened to Buddhism, where Buddhism used to be this difference, it was almost like spiritual religion, and then you got Buddhists now in Sri Lanka hanging 5-year-olds with fish hooks up for their whatever the hell god, and that's Buddhism. That's what they call Buddhism. It's a dead religion,
Right.
and that's happening to Christianity. And it's like, okay, we can say, well, okay, so how do we fix it? Well, you have to fix it because Western civilization is built on it. And when Christianity becomes bones and not useful, Western civilization goes with it. And so
Right.
you have two options. You can create a new foundation, which good luck with that because humans are way too tribal and the IQ is not high enough anymore for them to grasp it. So you have guys like Kurt that are proposing foundations, and it's like, okay, that's cool. Show me how you're going to integrate that
Yeah.
because I'm not seeing a way for that to happen. It's like you might have all of the materials to build a house's foundation, but if you have to either demolish the house or lift it up. and you haven't shown me that you have the means to do either of those things, and so that's a concern.
Yeah. So this is something. This is that question is what I end up thinking about and working on the most. So you know, I think what I'll we'll jump to the modern day and the situation we're in for a second, and the thing I go back and forth between is can we help Christianity to evolve or adapt or have a new denomination or something to help it survive or thrive? And is that really what we should do, or should we just let it die and start something new? This is the thing I kind of teeter back and forth. How do you feel about that?
It depends what you want, and I look at the big picture, and it's like, okay, in 2 generations from now, can they handle this?
Mm-hmm.
So, we have a Gen Z is the most tribalized, intellectualized generation that I have ever seen because we were raised on the internet.
Right.
And so none of us believe the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
We're hyper individual. And people don't always understand that because they go to New York City where it's a mouse utopia or LA and they're all narcissistic, they don't shut up, and they're filming themselves doing literally anything. Half of them are filming themselves fucking a piece of plastic. The other half are filming themselves monologuing or reacting to reactions of reactions, and it's just like, okay, this is not Gen Z. This is city people. They're crazy. They've always been like this. You can
Right.
look at Thomas fucking Jefferson. He said New York is the craziest fucking place he's ever seen in his life. Like, city people are always crazy.
Right.
Look at the general conglomerate of Gen Zers. We are hyper individualized and we don't believe in anything.
Right.
And so when Christianity comes around, like people who represent Christianity, let me give you as an example, people like Matt Walsh, which is just a troglodyte. They he was commenting yesterday about some chick in Nebraska went to jail for giving her daughter abortion pills or whatever, and she was fucking stupid for getting rid of the thing the way she did.
Right.
Because once she touched it, it was murder. But not to get topic of the day ish with you. But he was like, "Oh, this isn't enough of a penalty," and I'm like, "Okay, dude, we can't. You can't just start jailing 13-year-old girls like you for not complying with their worldviews." And it's
Right.
like you need to have some nuance here, but they don't want to compromise. And he's like, "This isn't severe enough," and I'm like, "Okay, so you're telling Gen Z that you're giving them more restrictions, which is what they're terrified of. They don't want more restrictions. They want you to leave them the fuck alone."
Mm-hmm.
And the right doesn't understand this. The left doesn't understand this. The Christians don't understand this. And the Christians who do understand it are going way, way too far. Like, I have a church down the street. They have a whole bunch of fucking signs. It's like the rainbow, and it's like all kinds of people are welcome here. And then they have a verse on the other side of the building that's talking about God smiting sinners.
Right.
And it's like you can't have it both ways. You're either a Christian or you're not. Um, and they don't want to choose. They're trying to have it both ways, and it's like, so you're just gonna have a hollow religion that people are gonna fill with idiots, and you're gonna have a little clubhouse. You're not gonna have a hierarchy anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
and so when I'm looking at solutions, it's like, does the solution need to come from despair, or does it need to come before despair? Christianity came from despair.
Yeah.
So who's to say that the next wave of meaning can't come from that? Science has not served us in any way societally, with the exception of lifespan. So,
Mm.
um, I would wager humanity would opt to cut off 20 years of their life in exchange for meaning, which I have a feeling will occur, just based off of trajectories. And so they're going to sacrifice science for something that means more. And, maybe they go back to dying at 65, but they'll be happier, so who the fuck cares?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Uh, One thing, yeah. So talking about like which path we should take. Should we try to somehow adapt Christianity, or should we just move on to something else? I mean, that's a great frame. Is like, well, what's going to work for Zoomers? What's going to work for the next generation? That's a huge question. And you brought up some great points about that. Which is that, like, the internet and the individuality and some of what their kind of group, I say group generational strategy is, so to speak, and some of the constraints that they're under. And given that, like, from that analysis, I would say I don't think Christianity can step up to the plate. I don't think it can. adapt. Even like we just talked about how the Roman Empire is good because they've got structure and they've got people who can kind of try to adopt it. But ultimately, if anything, if Christianity tries to do that, it's like what you just said. They just hang some rainbow flags, which is a total contradiction of their own thing. It just adds more cognitive dissonance, and so it's just going to continue to die and crumble. And so really, it's kind of like, okay, well, Christianity's not working. So now what you have is you got a generation of millennials and leftists and Zoomers who are in this like whole nihilistic, moralist, woke culture, relativism, and that's not working either. Right, and to tie it in as to another thing you said, you talked about how Christianity came from despair. Well, it's looking like we're heading towards a state of despair through these current mechanisms, and or if not a full-on dark ages, and that may catalyze the next thing. So Christianity's not going to work. Wokeism's not going to
Keep in
work.
mind, keep in just because this is important. Keep in mind that Dark Ages are almost always regional.
Interesting. Yeah, which is even
Yeah,
weirder considering we have the internet now. It's like,
yeah, so the only thing that's gonna so it's complicated. So we're global and we have an excess of like 200% across the board for most things, with the exception of technology.
right.
So, let's say we lose. I mean, the only thing that would cause us to go back to like pre-Babylon times would be a solar flare wiping out probably 90. It would probably wipe out all electricity, and then within 9 months, 90% of the population would be dead.
Yeah.
The only survivors would be those who are most violent, and then communities who are prepared, which is probably going to be primarily Appalachia because most of them are hyperbolists and preppers anyway.
Yeah.
And they're communal.
Oh yeah.
And then probably places in New York where the most violent thrives, and then Appalachia could overwhelm them. And so that we would go back to like how it was back in the Ion of Aries, where everyone's just fighting each other. It's a warring tribal state,
Right.
and you have kids, and the women pop out children, and the men go to war and they die. That will be the future for we'll do that for 2,000 years. We'll rediscover technology. We'll do it all over again.
Wow.
Outside of that, the Dark Age will be regional
Wow.
because Africa will probably lose most of their population if we cut off globalism, but it won't ever happen in an event. It will be a grinding phenomena.
Man.
Rome was
Wow.
a grinding phenomena. But if you look at places like Indo America, is that what it's called? Indo America? It's Central America anyway. Most of them they stayed stagnant for the most part.
Hmm.
Um, and then you go from stagnation and they build their empires, and then around the 1400s they peaked, and then we killed them with disease.
Um.
So dark ages are definitely isolated, because
Well.
China was indifferent to the Roman dark age.
But I feel like a part of that is just a factor of the time period. But again, like they were not a global civilization at the time. You had disconnected regions of the planet that weren't trading or communicating. But now we have a global culture. We have the internet, so it's almost like an all or nothing. Like the whole planet's going to be in a dark age
No,
or not.
so not necessarily. What would happen when we enter a dark age is when the primary policeman of the country of the world collapses, which is us.
Right.
And so we just return to the 1700s. We're not going to fall that far back.
So you said we fall to the 1700s, but we still have the technology, right? We still have internet.
No, we have the capacity. We have the knowledge, not the means. We
Hmm.
can't build EVs without China or the Congo. We can't build semiconductors and chips without things like Taiwan. And it's like, okay, well, you can reshore it, but where are you getting your neon, your lithium? Where are these mines at?
Well,
And they're global.
surely somebody rises to the challenge and tries to make a move, whether it's China or somebody. If some of these isolated regions are dark regions or who are cut off from the other, somebody's gonna become the next police. Maybe, maybe not. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's the assumption. I mean, America is getting hit from all sides right now in terms of immigration, and honestly, if I were them, I'd be plotting rebellions today, and they're stupid for not doing that. Um, just from a game theoretics perspective, but
Yeah,
they're not, and they're just coming in waves.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the only I would imagine they would drag us down a little bit, but we also the way our government's built, the people assimilate really, really well. The Hispanics assimilate within about 2 generations. West Africans assimilate within about four, and then the more south you go, with the exception of Cape Town, which is all whites, they assimilate probably never, because the genetic line for that region, the most violent survived. You know, like look at the Zulus; they were fucking savages. They were some of the best killers that we've ever seen in history.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so I mean, that's evolutionary pressure that's in them and their
Right.
bones. I mean, that's hard to get out of a human.
Um,
So I'm not sure that they could assimilate at all.
so let's rewind a little bit. So I wanted to say because you did this kind of future casting kind of situation where you talked about like the next like age of Aries and the kind of warring and
No, Aries was prior.
prior. Sorry, but just in general, like if we're able to map the astrological cycles onto historical cycles, and that's the benefit is that you can start to make predictions, and that's just a very fascinating concept to me. You know,
Yep.
because
And so the next would be Aquarius.
oh, sorry, Aquarius, yes.
Yeah,
Um,
so we're the phenomena is known as becoming an Aquarian man.
okay, and what's the timeline for that? When is that age supposed to begin? Aeon.
We don't know
Okay,
because we don't actually know when they started and when they go. We don't know how long they are because it's a psychological phenomena, which means that it's a an aggregate phenomena,
right,
not like localized. Because like you can say like, oh, Europe is in this cognitive state, but then you look at like South Africa, which is a failed state. Those locals are not where we're at psychologically. Maybe they are. Maybe we're just
well,
pissed off. I
okay.
don't know.
So this is a huge,
Um,
yeah, okay. So this is a
so
huge
it's
like
low.
reframing for me because I thought it was tied to like some like the I thought it was like tied objectively to like the planets, so we knew exactly when. But you're saying it's
See,
kind of a local,
this is the problem with the ion phenomena. But you also have to go back to, you know, it's within the realm of natural law and natural order.
right,
So genetics and game theoretics and you know, evolution,
right,
you know, natural selection would suggest that within that movements, you know, there is a spectrum
right,
of, you know, levels of violence, kinds of violence, pliability levels. So
right,
you know how well someone can assimilate something else.
right,
But yeah, I don't really know what to think about it because the ion of Aquarius is one of connection, community. You know, it's water. It's the flow of water. So it's
right,
supposed to be a very um like it's a very intellectual age, very, you know, communication centered, which is why, you know, like I said, billionaires, they like astrology. If you look at every single tech billionaire we have, they are obsessed with integrating man with technology, which is what that age would suggest we do. The interesting thing is, when I was reading Aquinas, to be honest, I came to this conclusion and I forgot what brought me to this conclusion. So this is going to be a jump, and I apologize. I don't have an explanation for the jump. It's just in my head, I remember what I came to.
that's okay.
I did the math, and Aquinas suggested that around the 2400s, which no, it was midway through the next age.
Okay,
So that would have been 1,000 years into the Iron Aquarius. The world either ends or we evolve into something else.
right,
Um, if you do the math for technological speed, the math would suggest that we probably could integrate within technology in that amount of time.
right.
Which is interesting because I don't know how you would integrate silicon into a genome, but I don't have any reason to suspect we can't figure it out. We're monkeys, but you know we're still gods. Um,
Techno monkeys. Yeah, no, I'm very big into that. Like, I'm very big into technology, transhumanism, a lot of that. You know, I've been actually playing like Cyberpunk recently, and all the, you know, they have like all
yeah, I mean it
the
goes
mods and stuff.
against it goes against human nature. So like if you look at human nature, my favorite breakdown of human nature was Robert Greene.
Yeah,
Kurt tests Robert Greene for reason, presumably just because he's into game theoretics.
right,
But yeah, his book, The Laws of Human Nature, he wrote in 2019, is probably the most accurate that I've come across. And then, you know, I'm out of the psych field now, but having spent most of my young adult life there,
yeah,
I would have to say he's more correct than wrong.
hell yeah. Um, yeah, it's interesting. That's a whole other conversation. I think that could be a good one for next time. Is to talk about like the because I talk about it with Martin a lot. He's very he's very anti like technological integration and like AI and stuff. He wants to kind of like either
But
halt it or
yeah,
go
it's
back.
it's hard. No, it is hard, and honestly, not all humans can integrate. So the more
Right,
liberal you are, the more open you are, your mind is probably primed to be more receptive to things like change.
right,
If you're conservative, I mean, and you force integrate technology into their genome and their bodies and their lives, it
yeah,
would drive them crazy, and they would either commit suicide or blow everything up.
right,
If you
yeah,
don't believe me, go look at what the Muslims did.
yeah. That's what's gonna
They
be
couldn't
really.
handle the fact that something was different than what they believed the world should look like, and so they started causing problems. And the conservatives, the traditional conservatives, definitely could cause problems like that too.
Yeah, I feel like we're at a weird, potentially like evolutionary branching point where some humans
Yeah,
basically merge with the technology or upload their content or some kind of this thing happens, and then you have the people who stay behind.
it's probably on the scale of whatever gave us this current level of consciousness. The suggestion is mushrooms.
Yes,
Um,
Terrence McKenna,
so
Stone Ape theory, hell yeah.
yeah, that's the suggestion. I don't like the aliens hypotheses. I do subscribe to the
Well,
fact that maybe a couple millions of years ago there might have been advanced civilizations throughout the entire galaxy, and then over time they all collapsed, and then they dumped all the resources onto one planet. That
interesting.
kind of makes sense to me.
Well, I was gonna say like I've
Um,
heard that the mushrooms are the aliens, which is really
that's
cool.
entirely possible. And actually, if you look at DNA, nothing across Earth's evolutionary structure suggests DNA should exist. So the logic would suggest that DNA was brought here
Yeah,
somehow.
interesting. Yeah, I've
The
heard some interesting theories about that. I'm
Well,
pretty
it would have to have been so long ago. I mean, it would have to have been like millions of years ago.
yeah. So I'll try to keep the frame again. I'll try to rewind again to kind of stay on a try to be a little bit more cohesive because we have a lot of good. I love how far we're like splitting things off because we got a lot of good conversations for the future. But let's rewind a little bit. Christianity. We talked about okay. We're not thinking Christianity is going to work like it. It definitely is not going to work like it is now. We don't even think it can even adapt. The woke movement and their immoral thing is not going to work. That's just going to crash things in the ground. So it really
Well, it's
is
just political religion.
exactly. And then so it's like what political religion is going to work then? You know what? And that's I feel like that's a big part of what I'm engaged in and trying to build, which is a very it's naturalism. It's very much revolving around nature as our arbiter. And that is kind of scientific. And like you said, scientific.
For most people, yes, I agree.
Well, and that's a good. You said like science hasn't given us much outside of like lifespan and stuff, and I think not yet. And and I don't even expect that the common person will really be able to have a very substantial scientific worldview. So what I think the goal could be is to create a scientifically informed religion that could that the masses could maybe pick up on, and that's and so really I already see that that's what's needed. So in my mind, it's kind of like, well, do I need to work that thread through Christianity or go over here and do it separately? And I'm kind of doing both at the same time to experiment and see if one works or doesn't, or if they both work. So that's kind of what I just wanted to add. That's kind
You
of
don't you don't want to alienate people though.
true,
Because when you start saying like, "Oh, we're going to use science as a frame." Science is not a religion, it's a tool.
right?
So our brains are wired to detect patterns. Science just is our process of using patterns to integrate it into our head as
Right.
understood. So when you say like, "Oh, I'm going to use science as a frame," science doesn't give people meaning.
Hmm.
And so you can't just create meaning because then you're just creating a cult. You have to look at the world, and I mean the universalists, they just say, "Oh, I exist to witness," and it's like, okay, witness like majesty, and witness like what
Hmm.
are you witnessing?
Yeah.
And so not everyone requires meaning, not everyone requires structure or purpose. It honestly has to do with genetics.
Yeah.
And so I have an issue with trying to force a global society to adhere to one thing because if that one thing worked, we would have come up with it over the tens of thousands of years that we were inventing religion. but we
Right.
all came to different conclusions.
Right, which is healthy. You want to have some mutations so that you can have a healthy evolutionary kind of like
No, I
a
would
gene
not be
pool
a
of ideas.
yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to like cults popping up. Like healthy cults. So like Mormonism is what I would call a healthy cult.
Exactly.
They
Yeah,
have a
that's what I was gonna
hierarchy.
say. Yeah,
It's a
like
structure that makes them, it makes them happy. It gives them meaning. The men are happy because they can have multiple wives. The women can opt for monogamy if they choose to. Like it
right.
honestly solves for a lot of problems. It's
Yeah.
kind of fucking retarded, but it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I've said that about them, and that's the point I was going to make about cults is that I don't see cults as being inherently bad. And the other thing about cults is that there already are so many cults. Like there's obviously Christianity is a cult, and people like the Mormons are a cult, but there's so many other ones. Like there's so many culture like within our culture, like certain musicians have a cult following. Like sports, like in the South, like college football is like a cult. Like even like my even football in my hometown is like a cult. So like there's so many different cults, and so it's really just more about you're gonna have that
well, we
make a
can't
good one.
start bracketing consumption and tribal. You're combining a couple of different things. So yeah, it is kind of like a cult following, but it's not a cult per se because there's no hierarchy or meaning. Football is just it's just consumption. It's distraction. So it's more along the lines of sedation, less
Um,
so than meaning.
I don't know,
Because
but
if you because it can't, it's not all encompassing. So like it's like why like when you ask someone what's stopping you from throwing yourself off your roof tomorrow,
yeah.
and it's football, like really, that's it?
I mean,
Because if that's it, then your IQ is low enough to where you're not gonna care anyway.
well, definitionally, a cult doesn't have to be all encompassing. Like you don't have to have answers for everything.
No, but it has to have the capacity to answer everything.
Well, is ignoring something an answer? I would say so. Like that's how Christianity does it. They just ignore things that are outside of there. They're just like or well,
Well, they didn't intend to do that initially. The goal was to create. Well, Christianity was built on top of Roman law.
yeah,
So that I mean, it was built to do a couple of different things. I have a theory that Constantine probably used it for his own purposes, and
yeah,
then it evolved into other things.
interesting.
Um,
So just to rewind a little bit. So like for example, I mean, I think it's an interesting. Well, do I even want to go into that about like what a cult is? Sure. So going back to like football, for example, it provides. It may not have an answer for everything, or the answer for a lot of things is just ignore it. Just don't pay attention to that. Pay attention to this. And then I think it does give a lot of meaning. For example, like what kind of team do you identify with and support? That's your tribe. That's your identity. What kind of players you cheer for? And for kids, growing up, it gives them an initiation ritual, something to focus on, a type of heroism that they can gain by being the
yeah,
star
but it's
player.
not sustainable because you view everything through that frame, and that conflicts with natural order.
But now I agree with that, and that is how we determine if cults are pretty much good or not. Is if they are sustainable and consistent with natural order. Um, yeah,
Okay, so if that's the frame, then that's fine. It's we're not determining longevity of cult. We're just saying
yeah,
it's a cult.
yeah,
That's fine.
exactly,
Okay,
yeah,
I'm
exactly,
I'm okay with that.
yeah.
That's an acceptable way to frame it, I guess.
Sweet. And then so with that, to rewind a little bit more, and what we're doing here, in a lot of ways, like I would, if someone's like, "Oh, the natural order is like a cult," I'm like, okay, like it's just we're just trying to formulate some ideology, and answer some of these questions.
It's
A
just
worldview,
friends shit talking. That's what you gotta say. You
yeah.
don't just completely dismiss it. It's like, nah, we're just talking shit. Don't worry about us.
Well, to me, especially in these initial stages, that is what it is, and that's how it starts. It's just people getting together, talking, and shooting the shit, and maybe it'll turn into something more structured.
The American Revolution solely ran off of 15% of the population. So I promise you guys are probably on the right track.
Yeah, yeah, I'm pretty excited. It is very grassroots, but I did want to incorporate it into that this larger discussion about because when we're talking about Christianity, we're talking about religion, we're talking about a cult or some kind of guiding operating system, cultural operating system. Okay, well that one's not working, wokeism's not working, so hey, let's try to make a
Well, the
new.
original occult tried to do that by merging a couple of different ancient phenomena that
Right.
was able to be carried on no matter the IQ, no matter the culture. I would definitely pull from that. I mean, if you're trying to create one from scratch,
Yeah.
but you don't
No.
want to go all
Yeah, no, I agree, and
crazy.
that's where I've actually, we obviously talked about it a little bit today, just getting into the esoteric and the occult. I'm actually with Paul. I think next week we're going to be talking about it more, and that very much is a lot of what has informed me and guided me. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I'm just pretty much like trying to apply some of the concepts about how to, and that's the interesting thing about esoteric. About esoteric basically means like like rare or kind of hidden. So does occult. It means like secret, hidden, and that's the beautiful thing is that at different times throughout history, these kind of occult people and groups and movements have been able to influence the larger frame. But at the end of the day, what they've done at a baseline is preserved for those inner circles, for those people capable of seeing the big picture
Well, yeah,
and
they
helping
just it's a
them.
base. They had a baseline like the Kabbalah. It's
Right.
I mean, it's nothing crazy. It's
Yeah.
everything that we know deep inside. It's just
Yes.
written down. So
Yes.
for those, 'cause, I mean, half the things that like in our heads, if we wrote down and articulated some of the aspects, like it makes us physically feel better. I don't know why, but it does.
Yeah.
And so when you have like inherent like truths about the world,
Yeah.
like as above, so below,
Yes.
there is nothing new under the sun. I
Yes.
mean, like those are inherent truths that abide by natural order and natural law. So
In the
when
the
you
funny thing is that like in the modern day there's this idea that like the modern day science has replaced a lot of what the occult did, and they have, but science can't really is not great at like preserving those like abstract or those gestalt things like the hermetic.
science was created to argue.
Yeah, to break things down and take
Well,
things
I mean,
apart.
post 2020, it's not, but
Right. Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
that's
like,
a whole.
and for most of science, it has been the entire purpose of science is to argue.
Yeah.
That's how we built the Western legal system. We built it to argue.
Yeah, and that's about kind of deconstructing, taking things apart to understand it. But then it's about, well, how do you what do we use to put things back together or to remember those like you were just saying, some of those things like as above so below, like the hermetics knew these things like balance and all things, like polarity, duality and
Well,
all
they used
things,
to use the stars.
and that too.
The star, they would point to the stars and they'd say, "This is the star. Here's the story of this star," and then they can extrapolate downward as much as they needed to.
Hell yeah.
Because we can compartmentalize our brains or do that very well. And so, I mean,
Hell
I
yeah.
can give you the words like, oh, conservatism.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of different things that I can unpack, but
Right.
my subconscious, like where all of my memory is stored, needs a starting point, and then I can extract more and more and more the more I explain.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great example of like how our mechanisms work. How it's like neuroscience might not be able to explain that necessarily in terms of like neuron behavior, but that's one of those abstract conceptual models that we can use. Hell yeah.
And neuroscience is half abstract anyway. They don't
Yeah,
even know where consciousness comes from.
that's true. It's an emergent. Yeah, it has trouble with these emergent phenomenon. It can talk.
Well, it really is not explainable. Like if you look, it's like why is the heart beating? We don't have a fucking clue why. Like we still don't know.
Yeah.
Like we do, but we don't. And it's like, whatever pressures created this, it's been doing it for so long. Like I don't like that evolutionists say the Earth is only billions or trillions of years old.
Right.
For in my head, when I map out incremental changes across evolution, it would need to be like 20 trillion years old for that to work.
Interesting.
I mean, just in my head, because I'm like, if you think about it, think about like a single cell organism
Right.
that emerged from the mud and how long that would take.
Right.
And then every incremental change up until humans. Like, that is not a 3 trillion years. That's like 40 or something. Like, that's
Right.
not a small amount of time. And I mean, evolution's definitely not definitive. I'm not one. I'm not a adamant evolutionist whatsoever. It's just the best theory that I have found
Yeah.
that makes sense, but I am not at all saying that that's the way that it is because I have a couple of issues with the way that it's been explained.
Yeah. Yeah. We actually just did. I think Paul and I just did a talk on evolution last time. I'm pretty heavy into it. That'll be another good one to continue. I mean, that will continue to be a huge topic. Um, hell yeah. Yeah, and I like the idea that the age of the Earth too is really interesting because it's hard to even conceptualize like millions and millions of years, like but
Well,
you,
yeah, like it's you have to if you go off of incremental changes and you try to do the math in your head, it's like you can if you like summarize it.
yeah,
Um, but it's like when you do it in your head, it's like that's not enough time. So,
shut that up. Yeah. Hell yeah. Cool. Well, I think we're coming close to an hour. I think I may go ahead and
This one.
stop it here as far as the recording goes, unless you had anything else you wanted to close out with.
No, not at all. Yeah.
Sweet. Alrighty. Thanks everybody for watching this. And we'll catch y'all next time. I'll go ahead and stop it there.